Okay, I want to first thank Jess Frost and Duck Creek for having us and for their amazing space and all that they do for our community, which is pretty incredible coming from art, music, poetry, all across the board in all kind of genres. So I'm happy that you're all here to support Duck Creek. And thank you for coming out today, as Jess said, in the inclement weather. And so my name is Meredith Hasemann. I am a teacher at the East Hampton Middle School, and I'm kind of a poet groupie, and I'm a poet as well, but these are some of the people who have influenced me, and they're going to read some of the people who influenced them and me. And this program came about, the genesis of it was one day when Grace shared with me Philip's poem for Robert Long, and I cried. I was so moved by the poem. It was beautiful, and I thought, wow, all these people who influenced us, all these people are on Long Island, and all these people are from the East End, and all these treasures who are here, and I didn't want to forget about them, so I started thinking, wow, and Grace and I were talking about the different people that we knew in common, and before I introduce the poets, I think I'm just going to talk a second quickly about my influences. I'm not going to read because they're going to read all of the people that I would probably have read. But Robert Long was a great mentor of mine, and I went to a reading of his at a gallery on Newtown Lane, and he read a poem called Tie City. And I included it in the packet up there of poets, of East End poets. I was so moved, I went to him and asked him if I could work with him, and he and I began to meet weekly and write letters to each other, and he helped me with my poetry and helped me to get published and helped me with a number of things, and it was fabulous. It was a great relationship. From there, I worked with David Ignato, who Catherine spoke about Canio's being a great reference point for poets. I found David Ignato's workshop through Canio, and I asked him if he would work with me. I took his workshop and then asked if he'd work with me individually, and he did work with me individually too for years, and I considered him a great mentor. And I took another class at the Art Barge where I worked with a poet named Naomi Lazard, and I asked her if I could work with her individually too. And so I had these personal relationships with these three poets who you're going to hear about today, all of them. And so all the other great poets that are here, Frank O'Hara, everybody. There's so much history that we forget about, so I kind of wanted to gather it in one place. And so I chose people who have been my mentors as well in poetry. And so we're going in alphabetical order here. So I'm going, because I'm a teacher, so I'm going to go in alphabetical order. We're going to start with Catherine Levy, who came to visit my class. It had to be 15, 20 years ago, and did a workshop with my students that was incredible. They wrote such great poetry out of that, and it was a great experience, and so I bought her book. And so I loved it, and so she has come to visit me today here and help us out understanding the rich history of the East End poets. And Julie Sheehan, our next in line here, I took a class at Southampton in their MFA program about creating a manuscript. And she was not only incredibly helpful with creating the manuscript, but she, at the end of the session, we had a kind of school-wide reading, and I read a poem, and she came up to me and said, I want that poem for Southampton Review, because she was the editor at that time. And I said, sure, and I gave it to her, and she published it in the Southampton Review, and then it was picked up for Best American Poetry in 2015. So if it wasn't for Julie Sheehan, I would not have been in Best American Poetry. So thank you, Julie. Grace Schulman is, she, you'll see everybody's histories in the bios. I can't do them justice, but she has had a beautiful, amazing career. She also came to visit my students and motivated them completely. Her one book, Without a Claim, I find to be one of the greatest, American East End kind of books of poetry, ever. I mean, so it's on the back table. So the poems back there on the table, there's a books by the panelists on the left-hand side as you're facing it, and there are books on the right-hand side by others who are not here, who we have lost, and they're who we're kind of dedicating this session to. And Philip Schultz will be our final reader, and not only did our children go to school together and did I teach his son, but he is, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the poem for Robert Long is what built this program really completely for me. And so I look forward to hearing that reading. So these are, in my world of poetry, esteemed poets reading esteemed poets, and the layers go deep. And I'm going to be quiet and let them speak for themselves. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Catherine Levy, and I'm going to be reading Frank O'Hara and my dear friend Harvey Shapiro. I just have to say something about Meredith. I've done a lot of itinerant teaching. I used to teach all over New York City, and I went into a lot of classrooms. And within 10 minutes of being in a classroom, whether you are working with a good teacher or not. And I knew within 5 minutes of working in that classroom that I was working with a great teacher. So it was so easy to teach her class because they were already working at a very high level. And, we would all be lucky to be 13 and be in her class. So, I'm going to begin with O'Hara. He's one of my handful of really favorite poets. I often feel that he's underestimated because he has this insouciant, casual manner, which conceals a very deep purpose. He was certainly a poet playing for the highest possible stakes. The first poem I'm going to read is called My Heart. And I think in a way it's a statement of his poetics. My heart. I'm not going to cry all the time, nor shall I laugh all the time. I don't prefer one strain to another. I'd have the immediacy of a bad movie, not just a sleeper, but also the big, overproduced first-run kind. I want to be at least as alive as the vulgar. And if some aficionado of my mess says, that's not like Frank, all to the good. I don't wear brown and gray suits all the time, do I? No. I wear work shirts to the opera, often. I want my feet to be bare. I want my face to be shaven. And my heart, you can't plan on the heart, but the better part of it, my poetry, is open. When we came out here, in addition to meeting the glorious Canio Pavone, who has got such a generous spirit and has been such a wonderful supporter of writers, over time we met a number of people who had been very close to Frank O'Hara. And one of them was the person who was probably closest to him in our world out here, and that was Joe Lasser. Joe was his roommate for 10 years, and he wrote a fantastic book called Digressions on Some Poems by Frank O'Hara, which I would recommend everybody to read if you're interested both in O'Hara and the world that he lived in. And sometimes, as in this little story I'm going to tell you, I conflate in my mind what Joe told my husband and me and what's in the book. O'Hara, as I'm sure a lot of you know, died very young at 40. And toward the end of his life, he was actually having trouble with his writing. He was a very successful curator at MoMA. He had an intense social life, and he had a very serious drinking problem. So he was beginning to be rather blocked. And before the poem that I'm going to read, he wrote a poem in which he talked about being blocked, and he said, I am lonely for myself. So in the midst of this crisis, Joe Lasser called him up one day. They were supposed to meet their friend Norman Bloom for lunch at La Ray's, which was this place where they all ate lunch all the time. And Joe said to O'Hara, you have a poem, right, for Norman, because Norman was going to go to Europe for a long time. And O'Hara said, no, I don't have a poem for him. I didn't know I was supposed to do that. And Joe said, well, I've written a poem for him, and he's going to expect one from you. And O'Hara said, I'm at work, and I don't have time to write a poem. He then went on to write a great poem, what I think is a great poem. And Joe told us that after he heard O'Hara's poem at lunch, he decided not to read his own poem. Wise move. This is a poem that I recite to myself constantly. As a matter of fact, my husband and I recite it to one another constantly. It's called Adieu to Norman, Bonjour to Joan and Jean-Paul. It is 12:10 in New York, and I am wondering if I will finish this in time to meet Norman for lunch. Ah, lunch. I think I am going crazy, what with my terrible hangover and the weekend coming up at excitement-prone Kenneth Coates. I wish I were staying in town and working on my poems at Joan's studio for a new book by Grove Press, which they will probably not print. But it is good to be several floors up in the dead of night, wondering whether you are any good or not. And the only decision you can make is that you did it. Yesterday, I looked up the Rue Frémicourt on a map and was happy to find it like a bird flying over Paris et ses environs, which unfortunately did not include Seine-et-Oise, which I don't know, as well as a number of other things. And Alan is back talking about God a lot. And Peter is back not talking very much. And Joe has a cold and is not coming to Kenneth, although he is coming to lunch with Norman. I suspect he is making a distinction. Well, who isn't? I wish I were reeling around Paris instead of reeling around New York. I wish I weren't reeling at all. It is spring, the ice has melted, the Ricard is being poured. We are all happy and young and toothless. It is the same as old age. The only thing to do is simply continue. Is that simple? Yes, it is simple because it is the only thing to do. Can you do it? Yes, you can, because it is the only thing to do. Blue light over the Bois de Boulogne, it continues. The Seine continues. The Louvre stays open. It continues. It hardly closes at all. The Bar Américain continues to be French. De Gaulle continues to be Algerian, as does Camus. Shirley Goldfarb continues to be Shirley Goldfarb, and Jane Hazan continues to be Jane Freilicher, I think. And Irving Sandler continues to be the balayeur des artistes, and so do I. Sometimes I think I'm in love with painting. And surely the Piscine d'Eligny continues to have water in it, and the floor continues to have tables and newspapers and people under them. And surely we shall not continue to be unhappy. We shall be happy. But we shall continue to be ourselves. Everything continues to be possible. René Char, Pierre Reverdy, Samuel Beckett. It is possible, isn't it? I love Reverdy for saying yes, though I don't believe it. There's a wonderful little dig in there, I don't know if you caught it, about de Gaulle continuing to be Algerian. There's so much in that poem, I can't tell you. This is a little poem of his, much earlier. It's called The Critic. The Critic. I cannot possibly think of you other than you are, the assassin of my orchards. You lurk there in the shadows, meting out conversation like Eve's first confusion between penises and snakes. Oh, be droll, be jolly, and be temperate. Do not frighten me more than you have to. I must live forever. Harvey Shapiro was a very dear friend of mine. He died about 10 years ago, but I still can't quite believe it. They were contemporaries, their worlds overlapped, but their styles are very different, and I don't think they had much impact on one another. I don't think I ever remember Harvey talking about O'Hara. So I find that interesting. I've been debating reading this first poem because it's probably Harvey's most famous poem, and it's overly anthologized. But the poem haunts me. It haunted me long before I met Harvey, and it haunts me to this day. And it says a lot about the myths that we create about this country. So I decided to read it. It's the National Cold Storage Company. National Cold Storage Company. It was written shortly after JFK was assassinated. National Cold Storage Company. The National Cold Storage Company contains more things than you can dream of. Hard by the Brooklyn Bridge it stands in a litter of freight cars. Tugs to one side, the other the traffic of the Long Island Expressway. I myself have dropped into it in 7 years, midnight tossings, plans for escape, the shakes. Add this to the national total. Grant's tomb, the Civil War, Arlington, the young president dead. Above the warehouse and beneath the stars, the poets creep on the harp of the bridge. But see, they fall into the National Cold Storage Company, one by one. The wind off the river is too cold, or the times too rough, or the bridge is not a harp at all. Or maybe a monstrous birth inside the warehouse must be fed by everything. Ships, poems, stars, all the years of our lives. I think that Harvey probably did most of the best work of his life in the last 15 years of his life, even though he was struggling with terrible health problems. Oh, okay. Okay. No one ever accused me of not speaking loudly enough before, Meredith. He was very friendly with David Ignato, and this poem was written about David's last days in the hospital before he died. It's titled austerely 6/20/97. It's Friday night, and I've just had another helping of Ben & Jerry's coffee fudge frozen yogurt because I saw David Ignato at Columbia Presbyterian, 8th floor, Milstein, room 426, after a quick ride on the Skip 9, the one that does every other stop. And David, who is recovering from a stroke, doesn't look too good. A transparent mask over his face, feeding him oxygen. Whiffs of steam eddying from it, or maybe contrails because David is going very fast, talking to himself and jerking his body violently. On the other hand, the view from his window is splendid. The lordly Hudson cloaked in late afternoon sun. I say to the nurse, his color is good, and she says, that's because we're giving him blood, pointing to the tubing. Count Dracula was right, she says. It makes you look good, but it's not for real. I have to tell you that reading that, I'm so conscious of how much better Harvey read it than any of us ever can. In those last years, I often asked him if he was writing, and his answer would be to mumble something or say no. And then a few months later, he'd get up at a place like Canio's and read dazzling new work. The next poem I'm going to read was not published in his lifetime, and most people didn't see it. From what I can glean from his the executor of his literary estate, Norman Finkelstein, Norman saw it. I think Galen Williams, his partner, might have seen it, but he made no attempt to get it published, which I find interesting because Harvey must have known this was a beautiful poem. And for me, it sums up his lifelong quest for clarity and a moment of truth. And it's called Psalm. Psalm. I am still on a rooftop in Brooklyn on your holy day. The harbor is before me, Governor's Island, the Verrazano Bridge, and the Narrows. I keep in my head what Rabbi Nachman said about the world being a narrow bridge, and that the important thing is not to be afraid. So on this day I bless my mother and father, that they be not fearful where they wander. And I ask you to bless them. And before you close your book of life, your Sefer HaKayim, remember that I always praised your world and your splendor, and that my tongue tried to say your name on Court Street in Brooklyn. Take me safely through the Narrows to the sea. Harvey, Meredith has asked each of us to read a poem of our own, so I'm going to read a poem that is very much about the East End, the collision, both literal and figurative, of the deer and the people, and the constant threat that the natural world is under here, and the comical notion that we as human beings have that there are invasive species like the deer. We are the invasive species, my friends. So this is written from the point of view of the deer. It's called They. They scare us with headlights. They swerve into our bodies. They surround us with houses and 10-foot-high fences. They attach words to our panic as if we were human. They clap their hands, shoot their rifles. They move a mountain of dirt in the middle of the forest, which isn't a forest, not anymore. Not anymore. They sign petitions against us, hundreds of letters scrawled on the pages. They have called the forest the final chapter. They plant forest flowers. They insert the new trees, and have dug a hole where the pond used to be, and filled it with water, carried hundreds of miles by the water sellers. They put up a sign, beware of the deer, a black figure leaping across a bright nowhere. They stand over our bodies. It is such a shame, and shake their heads and turn the locks on the doors. At night when they're sleeping or trying to sleep, we peer in their windows. What is coming next? They don't provide answers because we can't ask the questions, and neither can they. They just get in the cars and turn on the headlights and watch us watching them in our fear. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Julie Sheehan. I promise to be a lot dumber than Catherine Levy. Because, I was, when we were talking about which poets that we wanted to delve into, I picked for some reason John Ashbery and Barbara Guest, who I've never read. But now I've read her. She's quite interesting. And I originally thought I was going to talk about collage, and then I learned something that's probably something everyone else in this room had figured out a really long time ago, but I just figured it out now, so I'm going to share it with you, which is that what really connects these poets is this persistent making a run at the problem of representation, and it makes perfect sense because they hung out with painters, both Barbara Guest and John Ashbery hung out with painters and wrote art criticism, and of course painters had been thinking about the problem of representation and what to do about that problem since the Cubists made that their core thing. Listen to me, I'm like super excited about this idea that I'm sure all of you have already had. But me, it's new, so there you go. So anyway, a painter is saying, why do we need a vanishing point to create an illusion of depth when the surface is actually flat? Why can't we just go with what the flat surface is? And these are really good examples of what that looks like. So then I was thinking, well, how does that translate into poetry? What if a poet wanted to take on that same challenge? And what I think these two do in common is commit themselves to stripping the signifiers on the page, the words on the page, of their signified out here in the world where we are, right? Like, so if I say chair on the page, the word chair just stays on the page. It doesn't mean what Catherine's sitting on, what you guys are sitting on. And it creates this sort of hermetic language field that's like a canvas. It's sitting there on a flat surface on the page, right? And all the words in it can correlate with each other, but not out here to where lived experience or sensory experience is. So it's this deep questioning of whether language is that connected to sensory experience, right? And there's an early poem by John Ashbery that I'm sure you all know called The Instruction Manual. Do you know this poem? Oh my God, yeah. It's hilarious. It's from his first book, Some Trees, and it opens with something like, as I look out the window of this building, I do not want to write an instruction manual on the new uses of a new metal, right? So it's, the scenario of this horrible technical writing job, and he was a technical writer, so he probably had that job. But then the poem spends line after line, it's quite long, going to Guadalajara, exclamation point, Guadalajara, the city where the poet says, I've never been. But the poem spends all this time in Guadalajara. There's a festival in the square, and there are, children playing, and, we zoom in on characters who, go off and have little conversations, and, we get this detailed, vivid tour of Guadalajara, the city where the tour guide has never been. So the whole thing is just a big lie, but a very seductive one, right? And then the poem yanks us back at the end to the instruction manual and the work at hand and the actual world of the poem. Well, he pretty quickly dispensed with a framing device like that and started just plunging us immediately into the poem, the fantasy already on the page. I wonder if I should read, actually, the Barbara Guest poem I'm going to read actually is about this sort of project of stripping signifiers, stripping words of their references out here. So I'll read that one first, and then I'll come back to John Ashbery. And the poem is called, it's on page 221, so it must be this one. Yeah. The poem is called, and this is a thinky title, as my friend Scott Hightower would say. That's thinky. Here it is. An emphasis falls on reality. And you'll hear the poem start to believe its own illusions and then yank itself back, right? Like the sunset, the walls, the things in the poem are seductive, but the poem is not interested in falling for that. Okay. An emphasis falls on reality. Cloud fields change into furniture. Furniture metamorphizes into fields. An emphasis falls on reality. It snowed toward morning, a barcarolle, the words stretched severely, silhouettes. They arrived in trenchant cut, the face of lilies. I was envious of fair realism. I desired sunrise to revise itself as apparition, majestic in evocativeness, two fountains traced nearby on a lawn. You recall treatments of being and nothingness, illuminations apt to appear from variable directions. They are orderly as motors floating on the waterway. So silence is pictorial when silence is real. The wall is more real than shadow, or that letter composed of calligraphy. Each vowel replaces a wall, a costume taken from space donated by walls. These metaphors may be apprehended after they have brought their dogs and cats, born on roads near willows. Willows are not real trees. They entangle us in looseness. The natural world spins in green. A column chosen from distance mounts into the sky while the font is classical. They will destroy the disturbed font as it enters modernity and is rare. The necessary idealizing of your reality is part of the search, the journey where two figures embrace. This house was drawn for them. It looks like a real house. Perhaps they will move in today into ephemeral dusk and move out of that into night, selective night with trees, the darkened copies of all trees. So you can kind of hear in that poem, like everything stands for everything else. The wall is interchangeable with a costume and with the space that it donates to the costume. Like everything is trapped in this relationship with the other words in the poem, but every time the poem starts to be like, oh, I'm imagining the sunrise and I'm imagining the shadow of it jerks itself back to the page. And we see that move in Barbara Guest quite a bit. O'Hara is so glittering and dexterous that it's, you don't feel the struggle that you feel with Barbara Guest of taking on a problem of representation. And maybe Ashbery doesn't think it's a problem. I don't know. But I'm going to read a poem of his. To me, the one that most thoroughly, the masterpiece of signifiers stripped of their signified, is a poem called Daffy Duck Goes to Hollywood, which is in your packet. And it's just like, you can't tell where you are. And trust me, it's not about Daffy Duck. It's not about Hollywood, and I'm not going to read it. It's a little long. I'll read a shorter one that I kind of think might have been written out here. Who knows? It's called Wooden Buildings. Wooden Buildings. The tests are good. You need 1 million of them. You die laughing as I write to you through leaves and articulations. Yes, laughing myself silly, too. The funniest little thing. That's how it all began. Looking back on it, I wonder now if it could have been on some day findable in an old calendar, but no, it wasn't out of history, but inside it. That's the thing. On whatever day we came to a small house built just above the water, you had to stoop over to see inside the attic window. Someone had judged the height to be just right, the way the light came in, and they are giving that party to turn on that dishwasher. And we may be led then upward through more powerful forms of poetry, past columns with peeling posters on them, to the country of indifference. Meanwhile, if the swell diapasons blooms unhappily and too soon, the little people are nonetheless real. So I'll just leave you guys with that question of, you could see he's even using some of the same words as in the Barbara Guest poem, columns, this sort of weirdly generic word, columns, the word real, what's not real. But I don't know if, I don't know what the stakes are for Ashbery, and it's always been a kind of interesting experience to read him and feel like he eludes me. Is he laughing at me? Does he mock me? Or, or is he just flicking poems off kind of because he can, and like the language is interesting, and oh, look, I made this thing. Have a look. That's kind of the spirit I get from him, and less so from Guest, who seems more intense. But I would love to hear anyone else's insights into Ashbery, beyond the one that there's like, I don't know, dozens of advice column bits on how to read John Ashbery, and they all say the same thing. They all say, oh, just let him wash over you. Let him wash over you. So, we can all let him wash over us if we so choose. Okay, I've been asked to read a poem. I wasn't prepared. But I did find one that I think is in this sort of elegiac spirit of, reading people who are no longer with us, many of whom we love dearly. Although, I gotta say, I don't love Ashbery dearly. Like, is that possible? Maybe. I don't know. Others might be able to do that. But here's mine. It's called After the Memorial. This morning, fog banked in, refractory, of course, except for one gull, all else blank. Then dress shoes, lit candles in the heels, flanked in apse in the dead poet's memory. We know there are infinite views of illusion, just as there are varieties of children. So how could the sun's September gaze send in a light like pollen, dusting my work boot's tongue? I'm loath to look, though I am not yet light nor air, its scatterer. An hour ago, or better, I gleaned from living eyes, so plate glass blue they might have been 2 dimes flipped in the gutter, a total loss. Yes, it could happen to you. The optic theorem of crosshairs trained on hindsight. Thanks.
How
are you guys hearing us back there? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Walt Whitman was, and I believe still is, our greatest American poet. Walt Whitman was here. He was born in West Hills, Long Island. His family moved to Brooklyn when he was 4 years old. And he said that he returned and tramped much of Long Island all the way to Montauk, and he felt that he incorporated much of Long Island into himself. And I'm going to read just a passage or two from his prose diaries, in which he writes of our land here. He writes, "One does not wonder why people fall in love with trees, seized ecstatic with the mystic realism of the resistless silent strength in them, strength which, after all, is the last, completest, highest beauty." From Specimen Days, his book of prose, Seashore Fancies. Hours, days in my Long Island youth and early manhood, I haunted the shores, away east to the Hamptons or Montauk. Once at the latter place, nothing but sea tossings in sight in every direction. I remember well, I felt that I must one day write a book expressing this liquid, mystic theme. Afterward, it came to me that the seashore should be an invisible influence, a pervading gauge and tally for me. There is a dream, a picture that has come noiselessly up before me. It is interminable white-brown sand, hard and smooth and broad, with the ocean perpetually grandly rolling it upon it with slow measured sweep, with rustle and hiss and foam, and many a thump as of low bass drums. This picture, I say, has risen before me for years. Sometimes I wake at night and can hear it. This next passage is from Whitman's, I call it Leaves of Grass, some call it Song of Myself, but I think a better title is Leaves of Grass, the long poem that he wrote, 9 editions of, to his deathbed edition of 1892. I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. And the pismire is equally perfect, and a grain of sand, and the egg of the wren. And the tree toad is a chef d'oeuvre for the highest. And the running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven. And the narrowest hinge in my hand puts to scorn all machinery. And the cow crunching with depressed head surpasses any statue. And a mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. I tramp a perpetual journey, come listen all. My signs are a rainproof coat, good shoes, and a staff cut from the woods. No friend of mine takes his ease in my chair. I have no chair, no church, no philosophy. I lead no man to a dinner table, library exchange. But each man and each woman of you I lead upon a knoll, my left hand hooking you round the waist, my right hand pointing to landscapes of continents and the public road. Whitman, a hard act to follow. But, thank you. But Howard Moss was poetry editor of The New Yorker for many, many, many years. He lived here. In his later years, he lived in East Hampton. Found that he had to learn to drive in his elder years, which was very difficult for him to do, and he was given an enormous party in celebration of his driver's license. He said that for a long time he could only drive with an adult in the car. But as you can see, he had an impish, prankish sense of humor that I think of when I think of Howard, and for that reason I'll read an impish, prankish little poem he wrote. Actually, it was published in the New Yorker, and it's called Lullaby. There are no rocks in Rockaway. There are no sheep in Sheepshead Bay. There's never news in Newfoundland, and silent is Long Island Sound. But I think that he would not forgive me if I didn't read something more serious that he wrote. And I'll read, listening to jazz on a summer terrace. The stars come out. They might be made of snow. Below, a subtle drumbeat slips and snares its honey and sandpaper into nerves that pull long shadows out of paper bags, or shift like gears behind the window shades. Ozone sweat on chromium green felt saliva stops. The shifty seeds of drums, that flimsy shimmy, that old rat-a-tat, ampules of musk and dust geraniums. And this is very local. It's called At Georgica Beach. How roughly ambivalent the seizure is of the sea to fix each wave it undoes. In the wake each time of the breakage it was, each coming into the edge of dry dock, and then underneath the long drawing back, leaving the minor clatter of shell shock. It's day. The wind's up. The ocean's gambling with light. The dice thrown. The game is running away with itself in runnels and creases. The long cliffhangers, just as they strengthen their hold on the surface, break and capsize into the sinking spools and renewals of things getting ready only to be things. And the third poet I want to read is Naomi Lazard, a very dear friend of mine who died a few years ago. She was one of the founders of the East Hampton Film Festival. She wrote plays as well as poems and novels too. But Her book that I'm reading from is called Ordinances, and these are a collection of, I call them didactic monologues. They're rather bitter, cynical, dry, and reflections of a life lived, and some of them quite funny in a bleak way. In answer to your query, we are sorry to inform you the item you ordered is no longer being produced. It has not gone out of style, nor have people lost interest in it. In fact, it has become one of our most desired products. Its popularity is still growing. Orders for it come in at an ever-increasing rate. However, a top-level decision has caused this product to be discontinued forever. Instead of the item you ordered, we are sending you something else. It is not the same thing, nor is it a reasonable facsimile. It is what we have in stock, the very best we can offer. If you are not happy with this substitution, let us know as soon as possible. As you can imagine, we already have quite an accumulation of letters, such as the one you may or may not write. To be totally fair, we respond to these complaints as they come in. Yours will be filed accordingly, answered in its turn. One more of Naomi's ordinance on arrival. Welcome to you who have managed to get here. It's been a terrible trip. You should be happy you have survived it. Statistics prove that not many do. You would like a bath, a hot meal, a good night's sleep. Some of you need medical attention. None of this is available. These things have always been in short supply. Now they are impossible to obtain. This is not a temporary situation. It is permanent. Our condolences on your disappointment. It is not our responsibility. Everything you have heard about this place is false. It is not our fault you have been deceived, ruined your health getting here. For reasons beyond our control, there is no vehicle out. She wrote some happier poems too, but I'll stop. I'll let her go there. And I've been asked to read a new poem that I wrote really last week. And I read it only to one or two people who said, why don't you read it now? And so that's what I'm going to do. It's called Whale. November, on the shore, a low curved thing, driftwood, no, closer. A humpback whale stranded on shore, bloodied by rocks, slate-colored with grooves like fluted tile, sparkling in sunlight. There he lay, fins by his side, overcome by ship strikes, the eye small for his size, wide open still, but glassily unseeing. The cavernous mouth shut, a panoply of acorn barnacles stuck to the back, shining like jewels. Just yesterday, I'd seen one like him surfacing, the tail like wings, ready to blow, spurting a cloud of steam fanned by the wind. I could believe that once he was revered, a Chinese deity, Hebrew Leviathan, Inuit god, his oval scratched on ancient reddish rock with a prayer for a long life. I'll add majestic, imagining a crown on that sleek monarch of crashing waves. On that day, not yet winter, gulls shrieked above the orange rind of sun, the sky ash white. My sneakers dug in sand trackless with cracked ice, as I remembered years back how you and I ran down to sea, laughing. I thought not much of death, nor after that, until the day you fell. I could not lift you. Waiting for the ambulance, I studied your face and touched the bones below your shoulders, covering your body slowly. Help came for the whale. For though police may slight the wounded gull, they'll hurry to attend this large an animal. Waves churned around the giant carcass as Lilliputian workers grappled ropes. And while a crowd looked on, a yellow crane hoisted him up and sent him back to sea for nourishment of smaller fish. At last, thawed from my frozen stare, I turned away. The team obeyed your wish, no respiration. I did not want to hear that you were dead.
I'm going to start with Kenneth Koch, and we've heard from Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, and he was part of this New York school of poetry, and they were all involved with all the wonderful painters who were out here. And This is his last book, and I think one of his best. It's called New Addresses. And to my 20s. How lucky that I ran into you when everything was possible for my legs and arms and with hope in my heart, and so happy to see any woman. Oh, woman, oh, my 20th year. Basking in you, oasis from both growing and decay, fantastic, unheard of 9 or 10-year-old oasis, a palm tree, hey, and then another, and water. I'm still very impressed by you. Whither, midst falling decades, have you gone? Oh, in what lucky fellow, unsure of himself, upset, and unemployable for the moment in any case, do you live now? From my window, I drop a nickel by mistake. With you, I race down to get it, but I find there on the street instead a good friend, XN, who says to me, Kenneth, do you have a minute? And I say, yes, I am in my 20s. I have plenty of time. In you, I marry. In you, I first go to France. I make my best friends. In you, and a few enemies. I write a lot and am living all the time and thinking about living. I love to frequent you after my teens and before my 30s. You three together in a bar, I always preferred you because you were midmost, most lustrous, apparently strongest, although now that I look back on you, what part have you played? You never, ever were stingy. What you gave me, you gave whole. But as for telling me how best to use it, you weren't a genius at that. 20s, my soul is yours for the asking. You know that, if you ever come back. They're all great. But I warn you, if you open this, you won't be able to stop. To my old addresses. Help! Get out of here. Go walking. 46, I think, Commerce Street, New York City. The Croix de Brumes, 9,426, Paris, Georgia Tech University, Department of Analogies, Wonderland, the storefront, Grimm's Fairy Tales, 48 Greenwich Avenue. The landlady has a dog she lets loose in the courtyard, 7 Charles Street, which Stephen Wolf sublet to me. Hotel de Fleurs in Paris, Via Convicularia in Rome, where the motorcycles speed, 12 Hanley Road in southwest London. Oh, my old addresses. Oh, my addresses. Are you addresses still? Or has the hand of time roughed you over and buffered and snuffed you with peels of lemons, limes, and shells from old institutes? If I address you, it is mostly to know if you are well. I am all right, but I think I will never find sustenance as I found in you. Oh, old addresses, numbers that sink into my soul. 48, 19, 23, old worlds in which I was alive. It was great fun, and more than that. Okay, I think that's enough, Kenneth. Well, I mean, this is David Ignato's poems, 1934 to 1969, and there's another book thicker that goes with these and beyond. David was a dear friend. I met him when I met Grace in 1977. When I met Grace, she said I had to meet David. When I met David, he said I had to meet Grace. And so I went back and forth from one to the other. And David was quite a character. I think I'll, if I can what did I do with it? Let's see. He inscribed a book to me in which he said, and this describes a lot. He said, to Philip, the passionate pilgrim, going forth in this world, in the sickness of this world. So he had a dark side. Here's a small poem about his wife, Rose, a wonderful woman, wonderful artist. Rose is my apple watcher, sitting in a tree, and I watch Rose counting apples she believes in. She smiles, the whole crop in, and the one she throws me as the best, I believe, even if it will not chew, because I too am smiled in, just like you, old battered skin. And this, of course, is This probably was more famous than he wanted it to be. He was always asked to read this, The Bagel. I stopped to pick up the bagel, rolling away in the wind, annoyed with myself for having dropped it, as it were a portent. Faster and faster it rolled, with me running after it, bent low, gritting my teeth, and I found myself doubled over and rolling down the street, head over heels, one complete somersault after another, like a bagel, and strangely happy with myself. Against the evidence. It's really interesting to go through all of this and just pick 4 poems. I mean, I have to question myself. Against the evidence. I just wanted to find David, and David's in these poems. As I reach to close each book lying open on my desk, it leaps up to snap at my fingers. My legs won't hold me. I must sit down. My fingers pain me, where the thick leaves snap together at my touch. All my life, I have held books in my hands like children, carefully turning their pages and strengthening out their creases. I use books almost apologetically. I believe I often think their thoughts for them. Reading, I never know where theirs leave off and mine begin. I am so much alone in the world. I can observe the stars or study the breeze. I can count the steps on a stair on the way up or down, and I could look at another human being and get a smile, knowing it is for the sake of politeness. Nothing must be said of estrangement among the human race, and yet nothing is said at all because of that. But no book will help either. I stroke my desk, its wood so smooth, so patient and still. I set a typewriter on its surface and begin to type, to tell myself my troubles. Against the evidence, I live by choice. And a little last one, An Omen. I've always loved this poem. I love the bird that appears each day at my window. Whether the bird loves me, I can only surmise from its regularity. That's pure, David. Well, what do I say about Robert Long? Very dear friend. I met him early on when we moved out here, and I remember he insisted. He wanted me to meet. He wanted me to introduce. He wanted me to meet all these other poets. He wanted me to meet Julie, and he wanted me to meet Catherine, and he wanted me to meet Grace. And of course, I knew Grace before I met him, and he forgave me for that. Let me see where. Oh, first day of spring. My shoes are in their firing squad position in the closet. My dog's dead, but if he were here, he'd be snoring on the floor. Accidents will happen. If you make them happen, so much the worse. Yet everything goes by so quickly. The first stanza's already as ancient as any high school history, and sudden absences like those leave sudden holes. When I got cracked in the nose with a baseball bat playing grammar school softball, I saw angels, Lyndon B. Johnson, and doctors for the next 3 years, until my nose stopped bleeding and started breathing again. You could say my nose went on a strike. Now it veers toward Portugal, no matter where I'm headed. I'm talking about my generation or regeneration. I saw my best hand-patched jeans hit the heap, then reappear miraculously. on angels walking down Main Street. And one last, Chelsea. I'm comfortable here on 50 milligrams of Librium, $200 in my pocket, and a new job just a week away. I can walk the streets in a calm haze, my blood pressure down to where I'm almost human. Make countless payphone calls from street corners, buzzing. They go by in near neon trails. People like me, headed for black bean soup, for screams in alleyways, for the homey click of the front doors closing, heading home past all those faces you know you've seen before. Like a rear screen projection in an old movie, the actors pacing a treadmill or pretending to steer, and the same 56 Dodge weaving in the background. It's like walking into a room and suddenly realizing you had sex with everyone there, at least once, watching your friends' lives tangling as you grow somewhat older, somehow more resolute. Bookshelves grow too, and you notice your handwriting becoming more matter of fact. It's as if all that comic smartness we glided through in youth were somehow desperate. And now we come to terms with the sidewalks, coruscating glamour, the rows of dull but neat garbage cans, each with its own painted number, the poodles and patrol cars, the moon rising high like Hasemann over 8th Avenue. I get cigarettes on a corner, catch my reflection in the glass. I'm nearly tranquilized and strangely happy just to walk out near traffic, consider the asphalt intersections where kids lean on lampposts and fire alarms, where a man is shutting the iron gate on his ochre divans, where the beautiful taxis whiz and honk, clanking over sewer covers and smashing beer cans, and windows light one by one like comic strip inspirations, and me here on your street corner in my second favorite neighborhood in the world.